Bear cub protects, babies sleep from loud noises, the guardian angel in fur. The wind whispered through the pine trees that October evening, carrying with it something more than just the scent of approaching winter. Ethan Marshall stood at the kitchen window of their cabin, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the tree line blur into shadows. Something felt different tonight, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't understand. Jessica called from the nursery, her voice carrying that particular note of concern that had become all too familiar these past weeks. Their daughter Lily, barely 6 months old, was crying again. Not the hungry cry or the tired cry they had learned to distinguish, but something else entirely. A cry that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, triggered by sounds neither parent could identify. They had moved to this cabin 3 months ago, seeking the peace and quiet that would help their newborn thrive. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away, and the only sounds that usually reached them were the natural symphony of the forest. Birds during the day, owls at night, the occasional rustle of deer passing through. It should have been perfect for a baby's sleep. Yet Lily had become increasingly restless, waking at the slightest disturbance. Sometimes it was a branch creaking in the wind, other times a pine cone falling on the roof. Once it had been the distant call of a hawk, so faint that Jessica had to strain to hear it herself. The pediatrician in town had assured them nothing was wrong. Some babies were simply more sensitive to sound, she had said with a kind smile. They would grow out of it. But watching their daughter startle awake for the 5th time that night, Ethan wasn't so sure. He abandoned his cold coffee and walked to the nursery, where Jessica was gently rocking Lily back to sleep. The baby's tiny fists were clenched, her face scrunched in that way that made his heart ache. He reached out and touched her soft cheek, feeling the warmth of recent tears. Jessica looked up at him, exhaustion written across her features. They had tried everything. White noise machines that mimicked the sound of the womb. Blackout curtains that blocked every sliver of moonlight. They had even considered moving back to the city, thinking perhaps the constant hum of urban life might actually be more soothing than the unpredictable sounds of nature. But something kept them here, some inexplicable feeling that this place was where they needed to be. That night, after finally getting Lily to sleep, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air when he saw it. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. There, at the edge of where their porch light faded into darkness, sat a small shape. Too large to be a raccoon, too small to be an adult bear. As his eyes adjusted, he realized it was a bear cub, perhaps 6 or 7 months old, sitting perfectly still and staring directly at their cabin. Not at him, he realized with a strange chill, but at the window of Lily's nursery. His first instinct was alarm. Where there was a cub, there was usually a mother, and a mother bear near a home with a baby was a recipe for disaster. But something about the cub's posture stopped him from immediately going inside to call wildlife control. It wasn't aggressive or curious in the way young animals usually were. It sat with an almost human patience, its dark eyes fixed on that single window with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young creature. Ethan watched it for several long minutes, neither of them moving, until finally the cub stood and melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. He didn't tell Jessica that night. She was already worried enough about Lily's sleep troubles without adding concerns about wildlife to the mix, but he found himself checking the windows more frequently, scanning the tree line during his morning coffee, listening for sounds that didn't belong. 3 nights passed before he saw the cub again. This time, it was closer. sitting near the large oak tree that grew beside their cabin. Again, it watched Lily's window with that same unsettling focus. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, intending to scare it away, but as he stepped onto the porch, something extraordinary happened. A strong wind suddenly picked up, rattling the loose pane in Lily's window that they had been meaning to fix for weeks. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet night. From inside, he heard Lily begin to stir, the preliminary whimpers that always preceded a full cry. But before he could move, the cub did something that made him freeze in disbelief. It rose on its hind legs, reached up with one small paw, and pressed against the tree trunk. The branch that had been scraping against the house in the wind suddenly stilled, held in place by the cub's gentle pressure. The rattling stopped. Lily's whimpers faded back into peaceful sleep. Ethan stood there, flashlight hanging forgotten at his side, trying to process what he had just witnessed. The cub held the branch for another moment, then slowly lowered itself back to all fours. It turned its head toward him, and in the dim porch light, Ethan could have sworn he saw something almost like acknowledgement in its dark eyes. Then, as before, it disappeared into the forest, leaving him standing alone with a story no one would believe. The next morning, he finally told Jessica. She listened with the skepticism he expected, suggesting stress and sleep deprivation were making him imagine things. But that very evening, as they sat in the living room with Lily sleeping in her bassinet beside them, they both heard it. A woodpecker had chosen the worst possible time to begin its rhythmic assault on a dead tree near the cabin. The sharp, repetitive sound cut through the evening quiet like a hammer. Lily stirred immediately, her face beginning to scrunch in preparation for tears. They both moved toward her, but stopped when they heard something else. A soft thud against the tree, followed by silence. The woodpecker's drumming had ceased abruptly. Through the window, illuminated by the setting sun, they saw the cub. It was standing at the base of the dead tree, a small stone at its feet that it had apparently thrown with surprising accuracy. The woodpecker, startled but unharmed, had flown to a more distant tree. The cub watched it go, then turned toward the cabin. This time, both Ethan and Jessica saw it clearly. The small bear looked directly at them through the window, then at Lily, who had settled back into peaceful sleep. Jessica grabbed Ethan's arm, her fingers tight with amazement rather than fear. They watched as the cub sat down in what was becoming its usual spot, maintaining its vigil as darkness fell. Neither of them spoke for a long time, afraid that words might break whatever spell had been cast over this impossible situation. Finally, Jessica whispered what they were both thinking. The cub wasn't a threat. It was a guardian. Over the following weeks, the pattern became clearer and more incredible with each passing day. The cub appeared every evening as the sun began to set, taking up its position where it could see Lily's window. At first, they thought it might be coincidence, that perhaps the cub was simply passing through on some regular route. But the evidence of its deliberate protection became impossible to deny. When a family of raccoons grew too noisy near the cabin one night, the cub chased them away with a few huffing sounds. When rain began to drum too loudly on a loose piece of metal roofing, the cub found a large piece of bark and wedged it underneath, muffling the sound. The most remarkable incident happened during a thunderstorm. Ethan and Jessica had been dreading it all day, watching the dark clouds gather, knowing that the thunder would surely wake Lily repeatedly through the night. They had prepared as best they could, moving her crib away from the windows, turning the white noise machine to its highest setting. But as the first rumbles began in the distance, they noticed the cub behaving differently. Instead of its usual patient sitting, it was moving around the cabin's perimeter with purpose. They watched in amazement as it gathered fallen branches and leaves, creating small piles at strategic points around the house. When the storm finally arrived in full force, they understood. The cub had positioned these piles beneath the spots where water would run off the roof most loudly, cushioning the sound of the falling water. During the worst of the thunder, it stood on its hind legs beneath Lily's window, its body serving as a buffer against the vibrations that traveled through the walls. It was impossible, absurd even, yet there it was, a wild bear cub, soaked through with rain, standing guard over their sleeping daughter. Jessica began leaving food out for the cub, despite everything they had ever learned about not feeding wild animals. But this situation had already crossed so far beyond normal wildlife encounters that the usual rules seemed not to apply. The cub never approached the food while they watched, but it was always gone by morning. In return, its vigilance never wavered. Every evening it appeared, and every evening Lily slept more peacefully than she had since they moved to the cabin. Ethan started researching, spending his days off at the local library and talking to old-timers in town, trying to find some explanation or precedent for what they were experiencing. One elderly man, Samuel, who had lived in these mountains for over 80 years, listened to his carefully edited story with surprising seriousness. He told Ethan about old indigenous legends from the area, stories of spirit animals that chose to protect certain humans, especially children. He spoke of bonds that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and domestic, between human and animal. Most people dismissed such stories as folklore, Samuel said, but those who had lived long enough in these woods knew better. The man's words stayed with Ethan as he drove home that day, watching the familiar forest pass by his windows with new eyes. Perhaps there were things in this world that didn't require scientific explanation, connections that existed beyond what could be measured or studied. When he arrived home, he found Jessica sitting on the porch with Lily in her arms, both of them watching the cub, which had appeared earlier than usual. The baby was awake but calm, her bright eyes fixed on the small bear with what looked remarkably like recognition. As autumn deepened toward winter, they began to worry about what would happen when hibernation season arrived. Would the cub leave them? Would Lily return to her restless sleep? The thought filled them both with a dread they didn't fully understand. This strange, impossible arrangement had become such a fundamental part of their lives that imagining its absence felt like contemplating the loss of something precious and irreplaceable. But the cub showed no signs of preparing for hibernation. If anything, its attention to its self-appointed duty seemed to intensify. It began arriving earlier and staying later, sometimes remaining visible well into the morning hours. Jessica researched and discovered that cubs often didn't hibernate their first winter if they had lost their mothers, instead surviving on whatever food they could find. The thought that their guardian might be an orphan added another layer of poignancy to an already emotional situation. One particularly cold night, with the temperature dropping below freezing and frost forming on the windows, Jessica made a decision. She took an old horse blanket from the storage shed and placed it near the oak tree where the cub usually sat. Ethan protested that they were already crossing too many lines, that they couldn't turn a wild animal into a pet. But Jessica reminded him that nothing about this situation was normal. The cub wasn't their pet. It was Lily's protector, and protecting the protector seemed only right. The next morning, they found the cub curled up on the blanket, its small body finally relaxed in sleep rather than vigilant watching. It woke when Ethan stepped onto the porch, but instead of fleeing as a wild animal should, it simply looked at him with those impossibly knowing eyes, yawned, and settled back down. That was the moment Ethan truly accepted what Jessica had already embraced. They weren't dealing with an ordinary animal. they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied explanation but didn't require one. As winter settled over the forest, their strange family dynamic evolved and deepened. The cub, which Jessica had begun calling Guardian in her private thoughts, though they were careful never to name it aloud, became as much a part of their daily routine as morning coffee or evening baths. Lily, now 8 months old and beginning to crawl, would often make her way to the window to look for her protector. The cub would sit up straighter when it saw her, as if proud to be recognized. The local community remained unaware of their unusual situation. Ethan and Jessica had agreed early on that sharing this story would only bring unwanted attention, possibly from wildlife authorities who wouldn't understand the delicate balance they had achieved. So, they kept their secret, this private miracle that unfolded night after night in the shelter of the forest. One evening, as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, they experienced something that would remain etched in their memories forever. Lily had been fussy all day, cutting a new tooth, and nothing seemed to soothe her. Even the cub's presence hadn't prevented her from waking repeatedly. Around midnight, exhausted and at their wits' end, they brought her to the living room, hoping a change of scenery might help. Through the large picture window, they could see the cub in its usual spot, now covered in a layer of snow but still maintaining its watch. Lily, in Jessica's arms, reached toward the window, her cries momentarily stopping. On impulse, Jessica walked closer to the glass, holding Lily up so she could see better. The cub stood up, shaking off the snow, and moved closer to the cabin than it had ever come before. It pressed its nose against the window, exactly where Lily's small hand rested on the other side of the glass. The baby stopped crying entirely, her eyes wide with wonder. The cub made a soft sound, almost like a purr, but deeper, and Lily responded with a giggle that seemed to surprise even her. They stayed like that for several minutes, the baby and the bear, separated by glass but connected by something deeper than physical proximity. When Jessica finally carried Lily back to her crib, she fell asleep immediately and slept through the rest of the night. The incident marked a turning point. The cub began coming even closer to the cabin, sometimes sitting on the porch itself, though it never attempted to enter. Lily's sleep improved dramatically, as if the mere presence of her guardian was enough to ward off any disturbance. The house itself seemed to settle into a deeper quiet when the cub was near, as if even the building recognized and respected this unusual protector. Ethan found himself thinking often about the why of it all. Why had this cub chosen them, chosen Lily specifically? What force in the universe had brought together a human infant and a bear cub in such an impossible arrangement? He had no answers, but he found that the questions themselves had become less important than the reality of what they were experiencing. Some things, he was learning, didn't need to be understood to be appreciated. As Lily grew stronger and more aware, her connection with the cub seemed to deepen. She would babble at it through the window, and the cub would tilt its head as if listening carefully to every sound. When she began to pull herself up to stand, the cub would rise on its hind legs too, mirroring her movements in a way that made Jessica laugh and cry simultaneously. It was as if they were growing up together, two young creatures learning about the world in parallel. The winter passed in this way, days blending into weeks, weeks into months, with their unusual arrangement becoming so normal to them that they sometimes forgot how extraordinary it was. Friends from the city who called to check in heard only that they were doing well, that Lily was thriving in the mountain air. They shared photos of their daughter, but were careful to frame them so the ever-present guardian at the window's edge remained unseen. One morning in late February, Ethan woke to find the forest unusually quiet. The cub wasn't in its typical morning spot. and fresh snow showed no tracks leading to or from the cabin. His first thought was panic. Had something happened to their protector? But Jessica, always more intuitive about these things, told him to wait. The cub had never let them down before. They needed to trust that its absence had a purpose. That evening, as the sun painted the snow-covered forest in shades of gold and pink, they heard it. A sound they had never heard before, but recognized instantly. It was the cub, but it wasn't alone. Through the window they saw it emerging from the forest, and beside it walked another bear. Not its mother, they realized, but another young bear, perhaps a sibling or companion it had found. The two cubs approached the cabin together, and their guardian performed what could only be described as an introduction. The new cub was initially skittish, hanging back while their guardian moved to its usual spot. But over the course of the evening, it grew braver, eventually sitting beside its companion to maintain the watch. Lily, who had been particularly restless that day, seemed delighted by the addition. She clapped her hands and babbled excitedly at the window, and both cubs turned to look at her with what seemed like affection. From that night forward, there were two guardians instead of one. They took turns in a way that suggested communication and planning. When one would chase away a noisy animal or muffle a disturbing sound, the other would maintain the watch. It was as if their original guardian had recognized that the job was too important for one bear alone, and had recruited help. Jessica and Ethan could only marvel at this development. They had accepted one impossible thing, and now the universe had doubled down on its magic. They began leaving out more food, always at a respectful distance, always allowing the cubs to approach on their own terms. The new dynamic brought an even deeper sense of peace to their home. Lily slept better than ever, protected by not one, but two devoted guardians. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the green shoots of new growth beneath, they wondered what changes the new season would bring. Would the cubs remain as dedicated when the forest came alive with the sounds of spring? Would they maintain their vigil when food became more plentiful and the urge to roam grew stronger? These questions lingered in the background of their daily lives, unspoken but present. One morning, Ethan found tracks in the mud near the cabin that made his heart skip. Adult bear tracks, massive compared to the cubs' smaller prints. A mother bear had been near their home in the night. He checked and double-checked, but there were no signs of disturbance, no indication that the adult bear had been aggressive or even particularly interested in the cabin. The tracks simply circled the perimeter once, and then headed back into the forest. That evening, he watched the cubs more carefully. They seemed unperturbed, maintaining their usual watch without any signs of anxiety or fear. It occurred to him that perhaps the adult bear had been checking on them, making sure these human-allied cubs were safe. The thought was fantastical, but no more so than everything else they had experienced. Perhaps word had spread in whatever mysterious way information traveled through the forest. Perhaps their cabin was known among the local wildlife as a place where the usual rules didn't apply. The theory seemed to gain credence over the following weeks. Other animals began to appear more frequently around the cabin, not threatening but simply present. Deer would graze in their small clearing without the usual skittishness. Birds nested in the eaves without concern for the humans moving below. It was as if the cubs' acceptance of them had granted them some sort of safe passage among the forest creatures. Lily celebrated her first birthday on a warm April day, with the cubs visible in the background of every photo, though Ethan and Jessica were careful to frame them as distant, indistinct shapes that could be explained away as shadows or rocks to anyone who didn't know better. They had a small party, just the three of them. But Jessica couldn't help feeling it was really a party of 5. The cubs had become such an integral part of Lily's first year of life that excluding them from the celebration would have felt wrong. That night, after Lily was asleep, they sat on the porch and watched the cubs playing together in the moonlight. It was the first time they had seen them act like what they were, young animals full of energy and curiosity. They wrestled and tumbled, chased fireflies, and investigated interesting smells, all while maintaining at least one eye on Lily's window. It was a reminder that, despite their remarkable behavior, they were still wild creatures with their own lives and needs. As spring deepened into summer, the cubs grew rapidly. Their guardian was now the size of a large dog, its companion slightly smaller, but catching up quickly. Their dedication to their self-appointed duty never wavered, but their methods evolved. They became more sophisticated in their protection, anticipating problems before they arose. If a storm was approaching, they would appear hours early to make their preparations. If a particularly noisy group of birds was nesting nearby, they would encourage them to relocate before they became a problem. One day, while working in the small garden she had started, Jessica noticed the cubs watching her intently. She was staking tomato plants, a task that required hammering small posts into the ground. The noise would surely wake Lily from her nap. But before she could reconsider, the larger cub, their original guardian, moved to Lily's window and began making a soft, rhythmic huffing sound. It was timed perfectly to mask the sound of the hammer, creating a white noise that kept Lily sleeping peacefully. Jessica had to stop working several times, overwhelmed by the intelligence and consideration being displayed. The summer brought visitors, friends from the city who had finally made the trip to see their mountain retreat. Ethan and Jessica were nervous about how the cubs would react to strangers, but they needn't have worried. The bears simply melted into the forest during the visit, invisible but somehow still present. Lily was fussier without them, confirming what they already knew. The connection between child and guardians was real and profound. After their guests left, the cubs returned as if they had never been gone, resuming their posts with what seemed like relief. That night, Lily slept more soundly than she had in days, and Jessica found herself wondering about the nature of comfort and security. How much of what we need to feel safe is physical, and how much is something more intangible, the knowledge that we are watched over, cared for, protected by forces we don't fully understand. As Lily began to walk, taking her first wobbling steps in the cabin's living room, the cubs watched through the window with what could only be described as pride. When she fell, they would press closer to the glass. When she succeeded in making it from the couch to the coffee table, they would sit up straighter, as if celebrating with her. It was during one of these walking sessions that something extraordinary happened. Lily had been practicing for about 10 minutes when she suddenly changed direction, toddling determinedly toward the front door. Before Ethan or Jessica could stop her, she had reached up and, with the mysterious ability toddlers have to accomplish things they shouldn't be able to, managed to turn the doorknob. The door swung open, and Lily stepped out onto the porch, heading straight for the steps that led down to the ground where the cubs were sitting. Both parents rushed forward, but stopped in amazement. The cubs had moved faster than they had ever seen them move, positioning themselves at the bottom of the steps like spotters ready to catch a falling gymnast. Lily, oblivious to any danger, continued her determined toddle down the steps, her small hands gripping the railing Jessica had installed for this very purpose. The cubs moved with her, maintaining their protective positions until she reached the ground safely. Then, in a moment that would be burned into their memories forever, Lily walked right up to the larger cub and placed her tiny hand on its head. The cub froze, not in fear, but in what seemed like reverence. It lowered its head slightly, allowing the toddler to pat its fur with her clumsy, gentle touch. The second cub moved closer, and Lily reached out her other hand to touch it too. For a perfect, impossible moment, the three young creatures stood together in the dappled sunlight, connected by something beyond species or logic. Jessica found herself crying, and when she looked at Ethan, she saw tears on his cheeks too. They didn't move, didn't speak, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this moment to exist. Finally, Lily seemed satisfied with her greeting and turned back toward the house, toddling to her parents with a huge grin on her face. The cubs watched her go, then settled back into their usual positions, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. From that day forward, the relationship shifted again. The cubs no longer maintained the careful distance they had before. They would allow Lily to approach them, always under her parents' watchful eyes, always with movements slow and careful not to frighten or harm. They seemed to understand perfectly that she was small and fragile, requiring gentleness despite their increasing size and strength. The local veterinarian, Dr. Morgan, who Ethan had cautiously consulted about the health of some bears he had been observing, had told him that cubs this age should be learning to hunt, to forage, to prepare for adult life. Yet their guardians showed no interest in leaving. They did forage. Ethan had seen them eating berries and catching fish in the stream, but they always returned. Their commitment to Lily seemed to override their natural instincts to roam and explore. As autumn returned, painting the forest in brilliant reds and golds, they celebrated the anniversary of the cubs' first appearance. Jessica made a special dinner, and they ate on the porch where they could see their guardians. Lily, now walking confidently and beginning to speak her first words, pointed at the cubs and said clearly, "Bears, my bears." It was more than just recognition. It was a claim of belonging that went both ways. The second winter was easier than the first. They knew what to expect now. Knew that the cubs would stay despite the cold and snow. They had improved the shelter near the oak tree, creating a proper den-like structure that the cubs could use when the weather was particularly harsh. The bears seemed to appreciate it, though they still spent most of their time in the open, where they could maintain their watch. One snowy evening, as they were preparing for bed, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. It was a howl, long and mournful, and far too close for comfort. Wolves had returned to these mountains in recent years, and while attacks on humans were virtually unheard of, the sound still sent primitive shivers down their spines. They rushed to Lily's room, finding her still asleep but restless, as if the howl had penetrated her dreams. Through the window, they saw the cubs standing alert, their postures tense and ready. As they watched, more howls joined the first, a pack communicating in the darkness. The cubs moved closer together, forming a barrier between the cabin and the direction of the howls. Then the larger cub did something they had never heard before. It roared, not the small huffing sounds they were familiar with, but a full-throated roar that seemed impossible from an animal still technically a juvenile. The howling stopped immediately. There was a long moment of silence, then the sound of multiple animals moving away through the snow. The cubs maintained their defensive posture for another hour before finally relaxing. Lily never woke, protected not just from the small disturbances of daily life, but from genuine danger by her faithful guardians. The incident marked another evolution in their understanding. The cubs weren't just ensuring Lily's peaceful sleep. They were ensuring her safety in every way they could. They were guardians in the truest sense of the word, and their protection extended to the entire family. Ethan had noticed that even when he went out to chop wood or Jessica went for walks, one of the cubs would often shadow them at a distance, keeping watch. As Lily's vocabulary grew, so did her attempts to communicate with the cubs. She would babble at them through the window, mixing real words with toddler nonsense, and the cubs would listen with apparent interest. Sometimes they would respond with soft sounds of their own, creating a conversation that transcended language but somehow conveyed meaning. Jessica started keeping a journal of these interactions, trying to capture something that felt too important to trust to memory alone. One entry read, "Today, Lily told the bears about her breakfast." She held up her toast to show them through the window. The smaller cub tilted its head and made a sound that I swear was laughter. How is it possible that these wild animals understand not just our need for protection but our need for connection? What force brought them to us? What keeps them here? These questions became a constant undercurrent to their daily lives, but they learned to live with the mystery rather than trying to solve it. Some things, they had come to understand, were meant to be experienced rather than explained. The cubs' presence had taught them that the world was far more complex and interconnected than they had ever imagined, and that magic, for what else could you call it, was real and present in their lives. As spring returned once more, bringing with it Lily's second birthday, they noticed changes in the cubs. They were no longer cubs, really, but young adult bears, powerful and impressive. Their original guardian was now formidable in size, though still smaller than a fully grown adult. The second bear was catching up rapidly, yet, despite their size and strength, they maintained the same gentle vigilance they had shown from the beginning. The birthday celebration was larger this time, with grandparents making the trip from the coast. Ethan and Jessica had prepared them somewhat, mentioning that there were bears in the area that seemed unusually docile, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality. When Lily's grandmother saw her granddaughter walk confidently up to a bear and pat its head while saying, "Good bear, gentle bear," she nearly fainted. It took hours of explanation and demonstration before the grandparents could accept what they were seeing. Even then, they remained nervous, unable to fully embrace the miracle that their children had come to take for granted. But they couldn't deny the evidence before their eyes. Their granddaughter was safer with these bears than she would be with guard dogs. The bears' intelligence and intentionality were undeniable. That night, after the grandparents had gone to bed, still shaking their heads in amazement, Ethan and Jessica sat with Lily on the porch. The bears were in their usual spots, and Lily was singing them a nonsense song she had made up. The bears appeared to be listening intently, their heads swaying slightly with the rhythm of her voice. When she finished, the larger bear made a soft chuffing sound that they had learned meant approval or contentment. Looking back, Ethan realized that somewhere along the way they had stopped thinking of this as strange or temporary. This was their life now, a life where wild bears protected their daughter, where the boundaries between human and nature had blurred into something beautiful and unprecedented. They had been chosen for this, or had chosen it, or perhaps both. The how and why mattered less than the simple fact of it. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. As summer deepened, bringing with it warm nights filled with fireflies and cricket songs, the bears' behavior began to change in subtle ways. They still maintained their nightly vigil, but during the day they would often disappear for hours at a time. When they returned, they sometimes brought things, a particularly beautiful feather, an interesting stone, small tokens that they would leave on the porch like offerings. Lily collected these treasures in a special box, her bear gifts, as she called them. One afternoon, while Lily napped and Jessica worked on her laptop on the porch, she noticed the smaller bear behaving oddly. It kept looking toward the forest and back at the cabin, as if trying to make a decision. Finally, it stood and walked toward the trees, stopping several times to look back. Jessica felt a strange pull to follow it. After checking that Lily was deeply asleep, she did something that would have seemed insane 2 years ago. She followed a bear into the forest. The bear led her about a quarter-mile from the cabin to a small clearing she had never seen before. There, in the dappled sunlight, was something that took her breath away. The clearing was full of mountain laurel in full bloom, creating a natural garden of incredible beauty. But that wasn't what the bear had brought her to see. In the center of the clearing, partially hidden by the flowers, was another bear. This one was injured, its front paw caught in an old rusted trap that must have been left by hunters years ago. The bear that had led her there looked at her with those impossibly expressive eyes, and Jessica understood they needed her help. Moving slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, she approached the injured bear. It watched her warily but didn't flee or show aggression. Up close, she could see it was young, probably the same age as their guardians. The trap was old and fortunately not as strong as modern ones, but it had still done damage. Working carefully, her heart pounding with the surreal nature of what she was doing, Jessica managed to pry open the trap. The injured bear pulled its paw free and limped a few steps away, then stopped and looked back at her. In its eyes, she saw something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The bear that had brought her there moved between them, making soft sounds that seemed to be communication. After a moment, both bears began walking slowly back toward the cabin, the injured one limping but mobile. When they emerged from the forest, Ethan was on the porch with Lily, who had just woken from her nap. His eyes widened as he saw Jessica walking with 2 bears, one of them clearly injured. But Lily showed no surprise at all. She simply said, "New bear hurt. Need Band-Aid." The innocent confidence in her voice made both adults laugh, breaking the tension. They couldn't exactly put a Band-Aid on a bear, but Jessica did what she could. She brought out warm water and clean cloths, setting them at a safe distance. To their amazement, the injured bear allowed her to clean the wound, holding still with remarkable patience. Their original guardians watched the whole process with what seemed like approval. When she was done, the injured bear sniffed at its cleaned paw, then looked at her with those deep, intelligent eyes before settling down in the shade to rest. From that day forward, there were 3 guardians. The injured bear's paw healed quickly, and it joined the others in their protective duties. If anything, it seemed more dedicated than the original 2, as if it felt it owed a debt. The dynamics among the 3 were fascinating to watch. They had a clear hierarchy and communication system, coordinating their efforts in ways that suggested not just instinct, but actual planning and strategy. Lily adapted to the new addition instantly, naming it Boo Boo Bear, with toddler logic that made perfect sense to her. She would often sit at the window and narrate stories to all 3 bears, elaborate tales that mixed reality with fantasy in the way only a 2-year-old could. The bears would sit and listen, their attention never wavering, as if her stories were the most important things in the world. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled through the mountains with little warning. The weather alert on their phones screamed about dangerous winds and possible tornadoes. As they hurried to secure outdoor furniture and close storm shutters, they realized the bears were already in action. They had moved to the 3 most vulnerable points around the cabin, the places where trees might fall or wind damage was most likely. The storm hit with a fury that made the cabin shake. Trees bent nearly horizontal in the wind, and the rain came down so hard they couldn't see more than a few feet from the windows. Through it all, the bears held their positions, using their bodies to shield the cabin from flying debris. At one point, a large branch came hurtling toward Lily's window. The largest bear rose up and took the impact on its shoulder, deflecting it away from the house. When the storm finally passed, leaving the forest dripping and disheveled, they went out to check on their guardians. All 3 bears were soaked and exhausted, with minor cuts and bruises from flying debris. But they remained at their posts, unwilling to abandon their duty even for their own comfort. Jessica brought out all the old towels they had, and to her surprise, the bears allowed her to help dry them off, standing patiently as she worked. That night, Lily insisted on singing the bears a special thank you song. She stood at the window in her pajamas, singing with all the conviction her small voice could muster. The bears, tired as they were, sat up to listen, and when she finished, all 3 made soft sounds of acknowledgement. Watching this exchange, Ethan felt something shift in his understanding of the world. They weren't just coexisting with nature, they were part of it, connected in ways that science couldn't explain but the heart understood perfectly. As summer turned to autumn once more, they noticed the bears spending more time together, playing and wrestling in ways they hadn't seen before. It was as if protecting Lily had given them a purpose that bound them together as a family of their own. They had their own dynamics, their own relationships, their own communication that existed parallel to but separate from their connection to the human family. One crisp October morning, Ethan woke to find all 3 bears sitting in a row, facing the cabin, but something was different. They seemed to be waiting for something. As the family ate breakfast, the bears remained perfectly still, more focused than usual. Then, just as the sun broke through the morning clouds, they heard it, the sound of multiple animals approaching through the forest. What emerged from the tree line made them all gasp. It was an entire group of bears, 2 adults and several younger ones, moving slowly and deliberately toward the cabin. Ethan's first instinct was to get Lily inside, but Jessica grabbed his arm. Their guardians weren't alarmed. If anything, they seemed expectant. The approaching bears stopped at a respectful distance, and then something extraordinary happened. The largest of their guardians stood and walked toward the group, stopping halfway between them and the cabin. One of the adult bears from the group, a massive female, approached, and the 2 touched noses briefly. Then, one by one, the other bears approached and repeated the greeting. It was formal, almost ceremonial, and clearly significant. When the greetings were complete, the visiting bears turned their attention to the cabin, specifically to the window where Lily stood watching with wide eyes. The adult female took a few steps closer, her movements careful and non-threatening. She looked directly at Lily and made a soft sound unlike anything they had heard before. Lily, with the fearlessness of childhood, waved at the bear and said loudly, "Hello, bear friends." The adult bear tilted her head, made the sound again, and then turned back to the forest. The entire group followed her, disappearing as mysteriously as they had appeared. Their 3 guardians seemed different after that visit, more relaxed somehow, as if they had received approval or permission for something. Jessica wondered if they had just witnessed some sort of introduction to the larger bear community, an acknowledgement of the unusual situation that had developed at their cabin. The thought that their arrangement might be known and accepted by the wider forest community was both thrilling and humbling. As the days grew shorter and colder, they prepared for their 3rd winter with the bears. It had become routine now, the shelter maintenance, the extra food storage, the quiet understanding that their guardians would remain through the cold months. But this winter brought a new development. The bears began taking turns going into the shelter to rest, always leaving at least 2 on watch. It was a sign of trust, Jessica realized. They felt safe enough to actually sleep near the humans they protected. One snowy December night, with Christmas lights twinkling on the cabin and Lily excited about Santa's impending visit, they decided to include the bears in their celebration. They brought out special treats, salmon they had bought just for this purpose, honey-covered fruit, things they had researched and knew bears loved. They placed the feast near the shelter and watched from the window as their guardians investigated. The bears seemed to understand this was special, different from their usual feeding. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and when they were done, all three came to the window where the family sat watching. They pressed their noses to the glass, leaving foggy prints, and made soft sounds that seemed distinctly celebratory. Lily pressed her hands to the glass where their noses touched, and for a moment the boundary between inside and outside, wild and domestic, seemed to disappear entirely. That night, after Lily was asleep, Jessica found Ethan standing at the window, watching the bears in the moonlight. Snow was falling gently, covering their dark forms in white, making them look like something out of a fairy tale. He turned to her with wonder in his eyes and said what they both had been thinking for months. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. The bears had become family. They were as much a part of their lives as any human relatives, maybe more so because they had chosen this connection. The winter passed peacefully, marked by moments of quiet magic. Lily learned to read to the bears, holding up picture books to the window and narrating the stories in her increasingly complex toddler language. The bears would watch the pictures with apparent interest, sometimes making sounds at dramatic moments that made Lily giggle with delight. These reading sessions became a daily ritual, weather permitting, and even Ethan and Jessica found themselves looking forward to them. One particularly cold February morning, they woke to find the bears had done something unprecedented. They had built a snow wall around the cabin during the night, blocking the harsh wind that had been rattling the windows and disturbing Lily's sleep. It must have taken them hours, pushing and packing the snow with their powerful bodies. The wall was crude but effective, and the cabin was noticeably warmer and quieter because of it. As Lily grew more verbal, her conversations with the bears became more elaborate. She would tell them about her dreams, her toys, her favorite foods. She assigned them personalities and roles in her imaginary games. The large one was the brave knight, the second was the wise wizard, and the third was the clever scout. The bears seemed to play along, positioning themselves according to her narratives, moving when she directed them to different stations in her make-believe kingdom. One day, while playing this game, Lily became frustrated because the bears couldn't come inside to properly participate in her tea party. She stood at the door, hands on her hips, and declared with all the authority a 2.5-year-old could muster, "Bears need to come in, it's cold outside." Before her parents could stop her, she had opened the door wide, gesturing for the bears to enter. The bears looked at the open door, then at Ethan and Jessica, who stood frozen with uncertainty. The largest bear took one step toward the door, then stopped, looking directly at the adults as if asking permission. It was a moment of decision that felt monumentally important. Jessica found herself nodding slowly, and Ethan, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. Very slowly, with movements careful and deliberate, the bear stepped across the threshold. The cabin suddenly felt very small with a bear inside it, even though the animal was being remarkably careful not to knock anything over. It moved directly to where Lily had set up her tea party and carefully lowered itself to the floor, its bulk taking up most of the play area. Lily was delighted, immediately placing a tiny plastic teacup in front of it and beginning to pour imaginary tea. The bear sniffed at the cup with apparent seriousness, playing along with perfect patience. The other two bears remained outside, watching through the open door but not attempting to enter. They seemed to understand that one bear inside was enough, that balance needed to be maintained. After about 15 minutes, during which the indoor bear submitted to having a tiny hat placed on its head and a plastic necklace draped around its neck, it carefully stood and made its way back outside. Lily waved goodbye cheerfully, as if this was all perfectly normal, which, in their world, it had become. That evening, after Lily was asleep, Ethan and Jessica sat in amazed silence, processing what had happened. They had crossed another line, one that most people would consider not just dangerous but insane. Yet it had felt completely natural, even inevitable. The trust between them and the bears had grown to such a point that having one in their home seemed like a logical next step rather than a wild risk. As spring arrived once more, bringing with it Lily's 3rd birthday, they reflected on how much had changed since that first October night when Ethan had spotted a lone cub watching their cabin. Their daughter had never known a life without her bear guardians. To her, they were as natural and necessary as the sun rising each morning. She was growing up with an understanding of the natural world that was both unique and profound. The birthday party was a larger affair this time, with several families from town attending. Ethan and Jessica had carefully prepared their guests, explaining that they had very tame wildlife around their property, and asking everyone to remain calm if they saw bears. Still, the reactions ranged from amazement to barely concealed terror as parents watched their children play in the yard while 3 large bears sat peacefully nearby, keeping watch. One little boy, braver or perhaps more foolish than the others, approached the bears with the fearlessness children often display. Before his mother could panic, Lily took his hand and led him closer, saying, "These my bears, they nice. You pet gentle, like this." She demonstrated, running her small hand along the nearest bear's side. The bear remained perfectly still, allowing the touch, and the boy followed suit, his face lighting up with wonder. By the end of the party, several children had petted the bears under Lily's careful supervision. Parents took photos they would never quite believe later, and everyone left with a story no one would believe. The bears had been perfect hosts in their own way, maintaining their protective watch while allowing the unusual level of interaction. It was as if they understood this was important to Lily, and therefore it was important to them. As the guests departed and quiet returned to the cabin, the bears seemed to relax, moving closer to where Lily sat playing with her new toys. She looked up at them and said clearly, "Thank you for being good for my friends." The bears made soft sounds in response, and Jessica could have sworn she saw understanding in their eyes. They had been good because Lily had asked them to be, because it mattered to her. That night, as they put an exhausted Lily to bed, she looked up at her parents with serious eyes and asked a question they had been expecting for some time. "Why my bears stay with us?" It was a big question for such a small child, one that touched on the mystery they all lived with daily. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. She told Lily that sometimes in life, special connections happen that can't be explained. Sometimes different kinds of families find each other and decide to take care of each other. The bears had chosen to be Lily's protectors, and their family had chosen to accept that gift. It was like magic, but also like love, real and powerful, and not needing explanation to be true. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer, nodding sleepily and saying, "Bears love Lily. Lily love bears." As summer progressed, they noticed the bears ranging farther during the day, sometimes disappearing for entire afternoons. But they always returned by evening, always took up their posts as the sun set. Ethan followed them once, curious about where they went. He found them at a river about a mile away, fishing with remarkable skill. They were providing for themselves, maintaining their wild skills even as they chose to live this half-domestic life. One hot July day, a group of hikers got lost and ended up near the cabin, asking for directions. They were experienced outdoorsmen, the type who knew to be wary of bears. When they saw 3 bears sitting calmly near a cabin where a small child played, their confusion was evident. One of them, an older man with years of wilderness experience, pulled Ethan aside and asked in a low voice if these were trained bears, perhaps rescued from a circus. Ethan told him a version of the truth, that the bears had appeared when his daughter was a baby and had never shown any aggression, that they seemed to have appointed themselves as guardians. The man listened with skepticism that gradually gave way to wonder as he watched Lily walk over to the bears and sit down between them, leaning against the largest one as she drank from her juice box. The bear adjusted its position slightly to support her better, then resumed its watchful scanning of the forest. The hiker left, shaking his head, muttering about having to rethink everything he thought he knew about wildlife. Ethan understood the feeling. They had all had to reconstruct their understanding of what was possible, of how the world really worked beneath the surface of what science could explain. The bears had taught them that there were layers to reality that most people never glimpsed, connections that transcended species and logic. As Lily's vocabulary and understanding grew, so did her ability to communicate with the bears in increasingly sophisticated ways. She had developed a series of sounds and gestures that the bears seemed to understand, and they had their own ways of communicating with her. Watching them together was like watching friends who had developed their own private language, full of meaning that outsiders could only guess at. One evening, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, Lily stood at the window making a specific series of sounds to the bears. They responded with movements and sounds of their own, and Lily turned to her parents with a satisfied expression. Bears say storm coming but not bad, just rain for flowers. Sure enough, the storm that arrived an hour later was gentle, bringing needed rain without the violence they had feared. Whether the bears had actually communicated this, or Lily had interpreted their behavior through her own understanding, didn't matter. The communication was real, regardless of its exact nature. The local newspaper had gotten wind of their unusual situation, though Ethan and Jessica had managed to keep the coverage minimal and somewhat vague. The article that eventually ran focused on unusual wildlife behavior in the area, rather than specifically on their family. But it brought a wildlife biologist to their door, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in bear behavior, and had driven 3 hours after reading the article. Dr. Chen observed the bears for several hours, taking notes and photos with the family's permission. Her scientific training warred with what she was seeing, Ethan could tell. Finally, she put down her notebook and said, "I've studied bears for 20 years. What you have here, it shouldn't exist, but it does." She stayed for dinner, watching through the window as the bears maintained their vigil, and left with more questions than answers, promising to keep their secret while trying to understand it herself. Her visit marked the beginning of a subtle shift in how Ethan and Jessica thought about their situation. They had accepted it as a private miracle, but Dr. Donna Chen's reaction made them realize they were custodians of something that might have larger implications for understanding the connections between humans and wildlife. They began documenting more carefully, taking videos and photos, keeping detailed notes about behaviors and interactions. One thing Dr. Chen had said stuck with them. She mentioned that in all her years of study, she had noticed that bears had individual personalities, preferences, and what could only be called emotional lives. Science was only beginning to acknowledge what indigenous peoples had always known, that animals were not just bundles of instincts, but conscious beings capable of choice and intention. Their bears were perhaps just an extreme example of something that was actually more common than most people realized. As autumn approached once again, marking nearly 3 years since the bears had first appeared, they noticed changes in the forest around their cabin. More wildlife seemed comfortable in the area. Birds nested closer to the house. Deer brought their fawns to graze in their small clearing. It was as if the bears' acceptance of the humans had created a zone of peace that other animals recognized and trusted. One morning, Jessica found Lily sitting by the window, drawing pictures. She had progressed from scribbles to recognizable figures, and her current drawing clearly showed 3 bears and 3 humans standing together. But there was a 4th bear in the picture, smaller than the others. When Jessica asked about it, Lily said matter-of-factly, "That's the baby bear that's coming." Jessica's heart skipped, wondering if this was childhood imagination or something more. 2 weeks later, they had their answer. A young female bear, heavily pregnant, appeared at the edge of their property. Their 3 guardians approached her carefully, and after what appeared to be some sort of communication, they led her to the shelter they had maintained for 3 winters. She was wary of the humans but seemed to trust the judgment of the 3 bears who had brought her there. Over the next few days, they watched as their guardians took care of the pregnant bear, bringing her food and standing guard while she rested. It was clear she was close to giving birth, and equally clear that their bears had decided she needed protection. The cabin had become not just a home for one unusual family, but a sanctuary recognized by the forest itself. The night the cub was born, all 3 guardian bears stood vigil around the shelter. The sounds of new life emerged just as dawn was breaking, tiny squeals that made Lily clap her hands with delight. They didn't approach, understanding that this required distance and respect, but through binoculars they could see the mother bear nursing a single, tiny cub. Their guardian bears were tender with the new mother and baby, taking turns bringing food and standing watch. It was a level of cooperative care that Dr. Chen, when they called her, said was extremely rare in bears. But nothing about their situation had ever been typical. The bears had created their own rules, their own society centered around the protection of the vulnerable. As the cub grew over the following weeks, becoming more active and visible, Lily was beside herself with excitement. She would spend hours at the window, watching the baby bear play while its mother rested. Their 3 guardians included the new family in their protection, expanding their circle of care naturally and without hesitation. One afternoon, the mother bear did something unexpected. She picked up her cub gently in her mouth and carried it closer to the cabin, setting it down where Lily could see it better through the window. It was a gesture of trust that took Jessica's breath away. This wild mother was sharing her baby with them, acknowledging the strange bond that existed between their 2 families. The cub, still small and unsteady, looked at Lily through the glass with curious eyes. Lily placed her hand on the window, and the cub, after a moment's hesitation, placed its tiny paw against the glass on the other side. It was a mirror of the moment years ago when Lily had first touched their guardian through the window, and Jessica felt the circle of their story completing and beginning again simultaneously. As winter approached, they prepared for 5 bears instead of 3. The mother and cub would need shelter and food, and their guardians would need support in their expanded duties. But it felt right, this growth of their unusual family. Lily had started calling the cabin the Bear House, and herself the Bear Girl, identities that seemed to fit perfectly in their magical reality. Dr. Chen visited again, this time bringing a colleague who specialized in animal intelligence. They observed and documented, took samples of shed fur for genetic analysis, and tried to apply scientific frameworks to something that transcended science. Before leaving, Dr. Chen pulled Jessica aside and said, "Whatever is happening here, it's important. not just for science, but for our understanding of what's possible between species. Your daughter is growing up with a perspective that could change how we think about our relationship with nature. The thought was both exciting and daunting. They had never asked for their lives to become extraordinary. They had simply wanted a quiet place to raise their daughter, but the bears had chosen them for something larger, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and wild. Lily was growing up bilingual in a sense, fluent in both human and something else, something older and deeper. One snowy evening, as they sat together watching the bears, all 5 now, maintaining their watch despite the freezing temperature, Ethan voiced what they had both been thinking. What would happen when Lily grew older? Would the bears stay through her childhood, her teenage years, into adulthood? Or was this a magic that belonged specifically to her early years, something that would fade as she grew? They had no answers, only the present moment, which was gift enough. Lily was 3.5 now, articulate and imaginative, and her relationship with the bears continued to deepen and evolve. She had begun telling them complex stories, acting out elaborate scenarios where they all had roles to play. The bears participated with patience and what looked remarkably like enjoyment, moving to different positions as her stories required, making sounds at dramatic moments. One day, while playing one of these games, Lily announced that the bears needed names. Not the descriptive names she had been using, but real names. She stood before each bear seriously, considering, then pronounced her decisions. The largest guardian became Atlas, because he holds up the sky to keep us safe. The second became Luna, because she watches in the night like the moon. The third became Scout, because he finds things and shows us. The mother bear she named Grace, because she's graceful and full of grace, a sophisticated concept for such a young child. And the cub, now growing rapidly but still playful and small, became Hope, because baby bears are hope for more bears. The bears seemed to accept these names, responding when Lily called them, as if they understood they had been formally welcomed into the human practice of naming and being named. That night, as snow fell softly outside and the newly named bears kept their watch, Jessica wrote in her journal, "We are living in a fairy tale, but it's real. Our daughter is growing up in a world where the impossible happens daily, where love transcends species, where protection comes in forms we never imagined. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that these bears, this connection, this magic, has shaped Lily and us in ways we're only beginning to understand." The journal entry continued. Today, Lily asked if everyone has bear guardians. When we said no, she looked sad for a moment, then brightened and said, "Then we have to share ours." The generosity of her spirit, the matter-of-fact way she accepts miracles and wants to extend them to others, gives me hope for the world she'll help create. She's growing up knowing that boundaries are more fluid than we think, that connection is possible across any divide, that love and protection can come from the most unexpected sources. As winter deepened, bringing with it the hushed beauty of snow-covered forests and crystalline nights, their strange and wonderful life continued. The bears maintained their vigil. Lily grew and learned and loved, and Ethan and Jessica held space for a miracle they no longer tried to understand, but simply lived. They had become a bridge between worlds, a family that existed in the liminal space where human and wild met, and discovered they were not so different after all. The story of the bear guardians and the little girl they protected had become local legend, whispered about in town but never fully believed except by those who had witnessed it themselves. And perhaps that was as it should be. Some truths were too large for the world to accept all at once. They needed to seep in slowly, through the cracks in certainty, through the stories told by children who grew up knowing that magic was real and love could take any form. As Lily's 4th birthday approached, they began to notice new behaviors in the bears. Atlas had started bringing back unusual objects from his ranging. Not random forest detritus, but specific things that seemed chosen for their beauty or interest. Luna had developed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, positioning herself differently depending on what was coming. Scout had become even more social, sometimes playing with Hope in ways that made Lily laugh with pure joy. Grace, the mother bear, had begun to trust them enough to let Hope play closer to the cabin, though she always watched carefully. The young cub was curious about everything, especially Lily, and would often mirror her movements from the other side of the window. When Lily danced, Hope would sway. When Lily jumped, Hope would bounce. It was a friendship developing across class and species, pure and uncomplicated. One morning, Ethan woke to find all 5 bears sitting in a semicircle facing the cabin, their breath creating clouds in the cold air. They weren't in their usual guardian positions, but seemed to be waiting for something. As the family ate breakfast, the bears remained perfectly still, and Ethan felt that sense of anticipation he had experienced before when something significant was about to happen. Then they heard it, a sound from deep in the forest, almost like singing but not quite. The bears all turned toward the sound, alert but not alarmed. Through the trees, they saw movement, and then, incredibly, more bears appeared. Not just a few, but what looked like a dozen or more, all moving slowly and deliberately toward their cabin. Lily pressed her face to the window, excited rather than afraid. "More friends," she announced happily. Jessica and Ethan exchanged glances, uncertain but trusting their guardians to handle whatever this was. The approaching bears stopped at the same respectful distance the previous group had maintained, and then something extraordinary happened. One by one, each of the new bears approached Atlas, Luna, and Scout, touching noses in what was clearly a greeting ritual. Then, amazingly, each bear turned toward the cabin and lowered its head in what could only be described as a bow. Lily waved enthusiastically at each one, calling out, "Hello, welcome," as if this was the most natural thing in the world. After all the greetings were complete, the visiting bears began to disperse, but not randomly. They took up positions around the wider perimeter of the property, creating a second circle of protection beyond the immediate guardians. It was as if the bear community had decided that this place, this family, needed more than 3 guardians. They were expanding the protection, creating layers of safety. Dr. Chen, when they called her about this development, was speechless for a long moment. Then she said, "You're witnessing something that will rewrite our understanding of animal behavior and intelligence. This is coordinated, purposeful, community-based protection. It's unprecedented." She made plans to visit again to document this new development, but asked them to be careful about how much they shared with the wider world. Something this extraordinary could attract the wrong kind of attention. Over the following days, they observed the new bears carefully. They seemed to work in shifts, some watching while others foraged, always maintaining that outer perimeter of protection. Their 3 original guardians remained focused on the immediate area around the cabin, but they clearly communicated with the outer circle. It was a sophisticated system that spoke to planning and cooperation at a level that challenged everything humans thought they knew about bears. Lily adapted to this new reality instantly, as children do. She named the new bears too, though these names were more fluid, sometimes changing based on her mood or their behavior. She would stand at the window and narrate what she saw. Morning Bear is sleepy. Fishing Bear caught a big fish. Gentle Bear is playing with Hope. Her commentary became the soundtrack to their days, a child's perspective on something miraculous. One afternoon, while Lily napped, Jessica sat with her laptop, trying to work but finding herself constantly drawn to watch the bears. She had started a blog, anonymous and carefully vague about location, sharing their experiences. The response had been mixed, some calling it fiction, others recognizing truth in her words. But a community had formed, people who had their own stories of unexpected connections with wildlife, of moments when the veil between human and nature had lifted. She wrote, "My daughter is growing up in a world where bears ensure her safety, where the forest itself seems to have adopted her. She doesn't know that this is unusual. To her, this is simply how the world works, full of love and protection that transcends species. I wonder sometimes if she's right, if this is how the world really works, and the rest of us have just forgotten how to see it." As she typed, Atlas moved closer to the window, settling in his favorite spot where the afternoon sun warmed the ground. He looked at her through the glass, and Jessica could have sworn she saw contentment in his expression, not just the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, but actual happiness. These bears had chosen this life, chosen them, and found purpose and community in that choice. That evening, as they prepared dinner, Lily announced that the bears had told her something important. Ethan and Jessica had learned to take these announcements seriously, as they often preceded significant events. "What did they tell you, sweetheart?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice casual despite her curiosity. Lily looked at them with her serious expression, the one that made her look older than her years. "They said more babies coming, lots of babies. Spring will be full of babies." She then returned to coloring as if she hadn't just delivered a prophecy. Ethan and Jessica looked at each other, wondering if she meant more bear cubs or something else entirely. As the weeks passed and winter began its slow retreat toward spring, they noticed changes that seemed to confirm Lily's prediction. Several of the female bears in the outer circle appeared to be pregnant. Grace was teaching Hope more complex behaviors, preparing him for independence. And there was a general sense of anticipation in the air, as if the entire forest was preparing for something. One morning, they woke to find the bears had created something overnight. Using branches, leaves, and snow, they had built what could only be described as a nursery area, a protected space near the cabin but sheltered by trees and the structures they had built. It was deliberate, planned, and suggested a level of foresight that was staggering. Dr. Chen arrived that afternoon, having driven through the night after they called her. She stood looking at the nursery structure, tears streaming down her face. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked. "They're not just protecting Lily anymore. They're creating a safe space for their own young, centered around your cabin. They've decided that proximity to your family makes their cubs safer. This is coevolution happening in real time." The implications were overwhelming. Their cabin had become the center of a new kind of community, one that included both humans and bears as equal participants. Lily was growing up not just with bear guardians, but as part of a mixed-species family that was rewriting the rules of what was possible. As Lily's 4th birthday arrived, bringing with it the first real warmth of spring, the predictions came true. Within a week, 4 cubs were born to different mothers in the outer circle. The nursery area became active with new life. Tiny cubs exploring under the watchful eyes of many adults. Their original 3 guardians took on new roles, helping to watch and protect all the cubs, not just Hope. Lily was in heaven. She would spend entire days at the window, watching the cubs play, narrating their adventures, and occasionally offering advice that the adult bears seemed to actually consider. When one cub strayed too far, Lily would tap on the window and point. and often an adult bear would retrieve the wandering youngster. It was as if she had become part of their communication system, a human cub whose input was valued. The birthday party that year was unlike anything they could have imagined 4 years ago. Friends from town came, now used to the idea of the bears, but still awed by the reality. The children played in the yard while more than a dozen bears maintained a watchful perimeter. The bear cubs watched the human children with curiosity, and at one point, with careful supervision, some of the braver children were allowed to gently touch Hope, who had become comfortable with human contact. One parent, watching her daughter gently pet a bear cub while Lily instructed her on proper bear etiquette, said to Jessica, "Your daughter is growing up in a fairy tale. But more than that, she's teaching all of us that fairy tales might actually be real." It was true. Lily's matter-of-fact acceptance of the miraculous had begun to influence everyone around her. Children who visited their home left with expanded ideas of what was possible. That night, after all the guests had gone home with their incredible stories and photos, the family sat on the porch in the warm spring evening. The bears were all around them, guardians, mothers, cubs, and the entire extended family they had become. Lily was telling them about her party, her voice carrying across the clearing. The bears listened with their usual attention, and the cubs tried to stay awake but kept nodding off. Ethan reached over and took Jessica's hand. 4 years ago, if someone had told me this would be our life, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought because no words could capture the magnitude of what had happened to them. Jessica squeezed his hand, understanding perfectly. They had been chosen for something extraordinary, something that defied explanation but didn't need one. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, bright in the clear mountain sky, Lily began to sing. It was a song she had made up, a mixture of words and sounds that seemed to bridge human language and something more primal. The bears joined in their own way, soft huffs and rumbles that harmonized with her young voice. It was a lullaby for all the cubs, human and bear alike, a song of safety and love and connection. Watching and listening, Jessica thought about the blog post she would write tomorrow. She would try to capture this moment, this impossible, beautiful reality they lived. She would tell the world, or at least the small part of it that was ready to listen, that the boundaries we think exist between human and nature are illusions, that love and protection can transcend species, that a little girl and her bear guardians were proof that the world was far more magical than most people dared to believe. The song continued, carried on the night breeze, a testament to the extraordinary becoming ordinary, the impossible becoming everyday reality, in a cabin in the mountains. Protected by bears who had chosen love over instinct, a little girl was growing up knowing that miracles were not just possible but present, surrounding her every single day.